Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India. Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Today we are going to have a look at the resilience of the global aviation sector. By the word resilience I mean ability to withstand a change or any unexpected event. So, there are many shock events which are abbreviated as SEs. First, let us try to understand what is meant by a shock event as far as civil aviation is concerned. Any event which is unexpected and or unpredictable and it has got some repercussions on an economy, such an event can be termed as a shock event. The effect on the economy could be positive or negative. Both of them are called as shock events, but generally we are concerned more about shock events that affect the air transportation sector negatively. Shock events are due to unpredictable changes in exogenous factors. By exogenous factors we mean the factors which are completely out of our control and also they are not directly related to the day-to-day activities of a particular sector. Okay. And therefore, such changes cannot be explained by any economic model because the variables that are involved in the exogenous factors are completely out of control and unpredictable. Any economic model actually is affected or influenced by only endogenous economic variables. The exogenous factors or variables are completely out of the purview. Okay, let us first establish the logic and the reasoning behind studying the past shock events. Okay. Each shock event in the past teaches us some lesson or lessons. It helps us to react better if a similar thing happens in the future. Now, this is not always true. Many a times there are shock events which should help us prepare better for the future, but that is only if we learn the lessons and take proactive steps. Sometimes we do not learn from a shock event, and when a similar event happens again, we go through the same cycle and we have a feeling of deja vu. That is not a good idea, but it happens, and we will discuss that also today very briefly. There are some major questions to be answered whenever we study any past shock event. The first is, what were the elements of each of the shock events that we are studying, and also we are interested to know how much is the time taken by the specific sector that we are studying. In our case, it is the global air transportation sector. So, how many years or how many months were needed for the global aviation sector to bounce back from the pre-shock event condition that is the time taken to recover from the shock event, we are interested in studying that. So, these two important questions have to be answered whenever we study any past shock event. So, let us have a look at some shock events which had direct effect on the global air transportation sector. Some had a minor effect, some had a major effect. So, we do not want to go back too much in history. Let us start from 1968, when the first such event recorded in our history is the Middle Eastern War in 67 and the foot mouth epidemic in the United Kingdom. So, we start from 1968. The next shock event, which was a major one, was the 1974 mid 70s oil crisis, okay. And the economic regression that recession that took place in the next 2 years after the shock event of the oil crisis is also very important. So, somewhere in the mid 70s there was an oil crisis when the countries that produce oil came together to form the organization of oil exporting countries, or OPEC, oil producing countries called OPECs, and they suddenly increased the price of the crude oil. This had a huge repercussion all over the world in all sectors, especially in the aviation sector. So, I would say that this was the first major shock event of the recent years, and it led to many changes. Many aircraft actually became completely unaffordable because of the huge amount of fuel consumption they had. The first oil crisis in 1974 or so was followed by another oil crisis in 1979. This was much bigger and the effects were also much more far reaching. Next, in 85 there were multiple terrorist attacks, the Madrid bombings and other bombings as we know, and this also affected a lot. In 1991 we had the Gulf War, followed by the oil crisis and the economical issues in the UK. In 2000 there was this Y2K problems and many industries came up which promised huge returns in the dot-com sector. We call it as the dot-com boom, but then the dot-com boom faced a bust in the year 2000. In 2001 there were the very famous 9/11 attacks in the US, when for the first time terrorists used a passenger aircraft as a weapon of mass destruction, and the Twin Towers in New York, they were completely damaged and devastated by two hijacked aircraft. And then there was one more aircraft that was hijacked and it landed up near the Pentagon, resulting in some damage to the Pentagon, and also there was a fourth one which crashed in Pennsylvania before causing any other major damage. Then couple of years later there was a second Gulf War and there was a SARS crisis in the Pacific region. In 2008 the world witnessed a global financial crisis and a meltdown of many companies. In 2009 we experienced the swine flu pandemic, which also sent a lot of shock waves in the transportation sector. 1 year later, in 2010, there was a volcanic eruption in Iceland, and that particular eruption lasted for about a week, but it caused immense trouble and damage to the air transportation but operations. In 2010, an active volcano in Iceland started erupting, and the fumes that it created, they engulfed a large part of the European skies for about a week, and there was a huge effect of that in the air transportation, as we will see very soon. 1 year later in 2011, there was an earthquake followed by a tsunami in Japan, and in 2017 there was a Brexit, where the United Kingdom through a referendum decided to exit the European Union. And then there were many more. In 2018 there was a hurricane which lashed in the Philippines and also in Japan. In 2019 or 2020 we had the COVID-19 pandemic, which is the recent shock event for the aviation industry. So, we will study these one by one. So, let us look at some of the shock events that adversely affected the civil aviation industry. In this graph, on the x axis is plotted the years from 1950 to 2010. On the y axis we have the global air traffic passengers in billions, which are almost 0 in 1950, and they are increasing linearly till you have the first shock effect, and that is in 1979, the oil shock effect. And then there is Gulf War, then there is 9/11, and then there is the global financial crisis, and many more, as I mentioned to you. So, you can see that each of these shock effects generally leads to a small kink in the graph of the increase in the global air passenger traffic with time. So, let us understand how shock effects are actually studied and in a way measured through something called as a passenger gap or PG. What is a PG? This is a very interesting graph. In this you can see that there are two lines, the red line and the green line, which are almost overlapping except for some areas or some locations. Okay. For example, somewhere here and somewhere here there is a slight overlap, there is a slight difference, otherwise it is matching. So, the green line actually is the actual passenger traffic, and the scale is the left hand side from 0 to 3.5 billions. Okay. So, this is the same graph as I showed you in the previous slide, but on the green line we are now superimposing the filtered traffic, that is the potential traffic. Okay. So, for the scale for both these lines, the red line, which is the potential traffic, and the green line, which is the actual traffic, is on the left hand side, 0 to 3.5 billion passengers. On the right hand side we have a scale which is global air passenger gap or PG, the passenger gap, measured in terms of the percentage of potential traffic. What it means is how much is the percentage increase or decrease in the passenger traffic compared to what was predicted by the trends till that time. Okay. So, if you see the bar, the blue bars indicate the passenger gap. If you see these bars pointing downwards, that means there is a negative gap, and if you see them pointing upwards, you will see that there is a positive gap. Okay. So, let us have a look at the effect now. The grey bars that you see here, and here there are 5 grey bars, these are the first year of some shock events that took place. This data has come from the Global Travel and Tourism Report of the World Economical Forum in 2015. Now, let me explain to you what it means. So, if there is a blue bar here, it indicates that there is a passenger gap, okay, and it also indicates, now a positive passenger gap basically is good news, because there is a there is more passengers, and negative passenger gap is a problem. Okay. So, what we see is that every shock event, so let us make some observations in the same graph. First of all, the fall due to the oil crisis was the lowest, but lasted the longest. So, you can see these bars that you see, okay, this magnitude of these bars is numerically low, okay, but the gap between the two grey lines is the widest because of the economic crisis of 1979. So, the effect of that starts getting felt later, and you can see these are the years in which there is a low. In fact, this particular passenger gap was negative till about 1985, when it started to pick up and become little bit positive. So, the event happened in 1979, but till about 85 the market was slowly recovering and unable to come back to the normal predicted value. So, why was the effect so many years? Why did it take such a long time? If you look at the other effects, you will find that there is a sharp dip, but then there is also a recovery quite soon. So, why did the effect of this particular oil crisis in 79 remain for such a long time? Interestingly, this particular event was followed by another shock event of the global recession that was faced by the world economy in the 80s. This is this whole period when there is an economy being slowly recovering, okay. And then as the economy was trying to recover, there was again the second Gulf War. This again resulted in the downturn as shown in the purple arrow in the 90s. So, we were trying to recover slowly and we did recover in 85. Now, the blue lines are going to be 1 year after the event. Okay, so, you can see that the blue lines are slowly recovering and they go to positive, but then there is again there is a Gulf War, and because of that you have a few years of negative passenger gap. During the year 2000 to 2001, again you see huge two dips. One is because of the dot-com burst and also because of the 9/11, and the other one is because of the global financial crisis in 2008, somewhere here. Okay. So, you can see that there are these big bumps, but the black line shows, for example, this huge gap of about 4% because of these twin events that took place one after the other, the dot-com burst in 2000 and the 9/11 in 2001. So, this graph basically captures the effect of the shock events felt few years after the event, and slowly how the economy tries to recover, and therefore, the air transportation passenger demand also recovers till you have some other event which also brings it down. Let us look at some of these shock events in a little bit more detail. So, we are all very familiar, there were graphic images on television of the 9th September 2001 attacks, in which the twin towers in New York were bursted. Okay. This is the route taken by the aircraft. As I mentioned, there were 4 aircraft which were hijacked. Okay. So, all the 4 routes are shown here. Let us understand the repercussions of this shock event of 9/11. How did it affect the air transportation market in the short term and in the long term? Interestingly, these attacks, they led to some permanent changes, some related to the infrastructure and some related to the psychology. What are these? The US is a nation which has people with very high propensity for air travel, but after 9/11 many passengers, they got so scared and worried that it may happen again, that they avoided air travel and they shifted to other modes of transportation. And this was a very big major psychological factor. Okay. Then the air travel, which was previously quite easy going and simple, there were some very basic security checks when you entered an airport. it became much more time consuming and hassle. A new agency called as the Transportation Safety Administration was formed, which came up with detailed guidelines on how to handle the security at the airports. And we are all aware now that we have to take out certain electronic items and scan them separately. There is a whole body scan at some airports, and the whole procedure of checking into an aircraft is now very time consuming and hassled. All this is because of the security measures that became necessary or that were deemed necessary after the 9/11 attacks. Okay. The densely populated area or areas, they became easy targets for such attacks because they give the maximum publicity, and therefore people decided or started not to crowd more in densely populated areas. The numerical effect of the 9/11 attacks is as follows. The travel demand measured in revenue passenger kilometers, that is how much revenue is earned by an airline per passenger for every kilometer that the passenger travels, that is RPKs. So, the RPKs in the short run, they were down by 31.3%. Immediate effect of that, because the entire air traffic in the US was shut down for a few days after 9/11, and then slowly it recovered. But in the short run, 31.3% RPKs were lost. The yields or the income that an airline gets were down by 7.3% in the short run, and in the long run about 10.1%. Revenues in $1 billion, they were also down by about $10 billion per annum. Okay. So, although the system recovered after some time, so the permanent travel demand damage was not 31%, but only about 7%, but still the growth of civil aviation is approximately 6 to 7% a year, and the permanent damage was about 7.4%. The next major activity that affected was the severe acute respiratory syndrome, or SARS as we call it. The impact of SARS on the GDP is tabulated in this particular graph. So, we notice that the largest number of cases were observed in China and also the largest number of deaths, and you can see the table, it goes down. So, total the world saw around 8,100 cases approximately and 775 deaths. So, the first observation is that SARS travelled all over the world through the air transportation system. It went first from China, where it was where it originated. From Guangzhou in China, it came to Hong Kong through one infected passenger, and then this passenger travelled to Canada. Okay. So, and then from there it spread all over the world. So, the number of deaths all over the world was 775 before we could completely recover. The final damage to the worldwide air transportation sector was about $33 billion, okay, of which this corresponded to about 0.1% of the world's GDP in that particular year. And we can notice that the maximum damage was to the Chinese economy. Out of these $33 billion, nearly half of it, $14.8 billion, nearly half of it, less than half of it actually came from the loss to China. The next big one was US, then Canada, Hong Kong, etc. This particular loss of $14.8 billion corresponded to about 1 to 3% of the GDP of China during that year. Canada, which lost about $4.7 billion, corresponded to about 0.6% of its GDP. US did not suffer directly because US stopped all flights coming in from SARS affected country, but people also travel from other modes of transportation, they travel by road, etc. So, US did not suffer directly, but it lost around $7 billion in terms of GDP. So, everyone is connected with air transportation and you cannot limit a particular outbreak to only one place. It travels very far and wide. Before you start bringing in some restrictions on travel, it has already spread. So, in short, SARS has affected global economy in many ways, but 30% of the total economic loss was felt by the aviation industry. So, it was one of the major shock events. The global financial crisis that happened in 2008 was another shock event. European airports reported have lost 3 years of growth because of this particular crisis, and it led to a decline in the air freight volumes. But the question arises, why was the air freight affected? That is simply because when you have a loss in the financial sector, it also affects the production industry and the manufacturing industry, and therefore, directly the number of people who are going to tranship facilities also will be affected. So, you can see that there was a 12% drop, okay, in the forecast, and the revised one was about 9% lower. Let us look at the connection between global air traffic versus the gross domestic product or GDP. So, this graph gives you a comparison of the global revenue passenger kilometers with GDP of their respective years. So, on that we have superimposed some of the shock events, okay, and the red line that you see, the red line corresponds to the global RPKs, that is based on the percentage change from -4% to 14% on the left hand side of the scale. So, for the red line we need to refer the left of the scale, and the blue line is giving you an indication of the percentage change over years of the global GDP. Okay. So, what we see is that if you look at, generally the curves are overlapping each other, generally the trends are very similar, except sometimes in these yellow bands which represent the shock event. So, for example, here if you see, the global RPKs are very high, but the global GDP is very low. So, there is a gap, a huge gap, and there is a difference in the trend. Here it is increasing, here it is decreasing, here it is decreasing, here it is increasing. So, but for some exceptions, generally you find that these graphs follow each other. Here is one more exception where the trends are similar, but the numbers are very different. We observed that the RPKs are increasing roughly 1.6 times the increase in the GDP. So, you look at an increase in the GDP, you multiply by 1.6, you will get roughly the increase in the RPK. So, this shows that the RPKs, that means the growth in the global passenger kilometers and the GDP are directly connected. As GDP increases, the RPKs also increase somewhat in the same proportion. Is it consistent? Yes, it is consistent, except for the shock events. There you might find that they do not follow the same trend. Another important thing that we need to know is that although the whole world is connected as far as air transportation is concerned, and any shock event happening anywhere does have repercussions in the remaining part of the world, because people are connected through air and goods and passengers do travel across the globe. But sometimes changes in the economy of a particular location or an area, they may not affect the changes in the economy of another region, because they are not directly connected. Okay. So, there is a strange case of the Middle East, where if you notice that during the 12 months of the global financial crisis from October 2008 to October 2009, this is the 12-month period, okay, the international air traffic growth, you can see that except for the Middle East, which is shown by this grey colored line, It has consistently shown improvement, although the trends are not exactly the same, but from 5% to 10% to 15-20% there is an increase all over the world. On the other hand, the global economic or financial crisis has led to a reduction from about 0% to as high as 15% in some markets. Okay. So, these markets, the markets in Europe, North America, the industry and the Asia Pacific, they are somewhat connected, and therefore, the trends are very similar, but the Middle East has its own economical model which is not directly related, and therefore, they had a totally different trend. In fact, they were the only ones which remained consistently growth oriented during these particular 12 months, where the whole world had negative growth. The next major pandemic that was a shock event for the industry was the swine flu pandemic of 2009. This is something that should have given us an early warning, but we did not really learn. As I mentioned to you, sometimes we do not learn from an incident that takes place. There are many reasons for it which we do not want to get into, but this is one example. There was a very good warning about how a pandemic can spread unless measures are taken, but it was not taken. So, what was the impact of swine flu on the global aviation sector? Let us just ponder on that. First of all, it led to significant reduction in the air travel demand globally. Okay. The finances of the airlines were strained because the operating cost went up. Now, why did the operating cost go up? Because if there is a pandemic which is going to spread through respiratory means, then we need to sanitize the aircraft before every departure. We need to ensure that we do checks on the temperature of every passenger and crew members, because high temperature was a direct indication of the infection of the flu, and we need to provide masks to the passengers and the crew members, and in some cases to provide the body suit to the passengers seated on the middle rows. All of these do not come free, and the airline has to provide them if it wants to operate. So, these are the additional operating costs, and we have seen these costs also there during the COVID-19 pandemic. There also we saw that there was a increase in the operating cost of an airlines because of sanitization, temperature checking, providing masks, and also isolating or keeping a gap between the people. Okay. Then many countries came up with travel advisories and restrictions. So, certain markets were closed without any prior warning. Then there were quarantine rules implemented, and these rules were different. There was no uniform rule all over the globe. Some countries had 7 days, some had 14 days, some had some other way of quarantines. So, the airline has to adjust to all these last minute changes. Then many borders were closed. The people were not allowed to travel from one country to the other, and that also meant that they cannot travel by air. Okay. So, in short, the airlines had to adapt and bring in lots of measures, and they had to adapt to regulations which were kept on changing as a function of time. It is one thing to have some regulations and to stick to them, but as the pandemic emerges, World Health Organization and other bodies, the Center for Disease Control, they come up with different advisories. With those advisories, the regulations also keep changing. Okay. Some routes have to be suspended. These could be very profitable routes, but unfortunately, if there is a large concentration of infected people in those areas, then the airlines are not allowed to fly, and that also hits the bottom line straight away. But we realized globally that there are certain things to be done which help us together. This particular pandemic brought out the importance of international cooperation in sharing data and sharing it timely, okay? Sharing it quickly and timely in a transparent manner, so that actions could be taken by the world bodies like the WHO in reducing the far reaching effects, and then the travel restrictions also had to be coordinated, so that there is no chaos and there is no last minute confusion. So, the swine flu pandemic actually brought the global aviation operational scenario together. We learnt a lot from each other and we learned to integrate our systems with others. Okay. And it led to a huge boost to the adoption of digital technologies. Some technologies are so good that they are continuing even now. For example, online booking was made compulsory or mandatory when the pandemic came about. We could do a check-in using our mobile phone, avoiding the printing of paper or the boarding pass, paper boarding pass. And all these technologies, they were being proposed by the regulatory bodies as well as by ICAO and IATA, but it got a fillip because of the pandemic, and many processes became contactless, like face recognition, checking in without the necessity for touching anything. So, in a way, the swine flu pandemic increased the digitalization of air transportation. Now, this sounds very familiar because most of us have learnt about these measures through the COVID pandemic. But way back in 2009, we were given a warning that something like this can happen again, and therefore, we should have been more prepared. We should have had much better ways of communicating in time, but it did not happen, and because of that the COVID-19 pandemic snowballed into such a big problem globally. The next shock event that hit the European sky, but had far reaching repercussions all over the globe, as we shall see, is the eruption of an volcano. Now, this is a very big mouthful name. It is Eyjafjallajökull, Eyjafjallajökull, name of the volcano. It erupted in 2010. Okay. And IATA has come up with a very nice detailed document called is the impact of the volcanic ash plume in 2010 May, just a few months after the eruption. So, what was the impact of on air traffic? Because of this volcanic eruption, we witnessed the largest shutdown of air traffic in Europe since Second World War. 19,000 odd flights were cancelled over a period of just 1 week. 30% of the global passenger traffic, or 4899 million available seat kilometers, were deleted or affected. Okay. This ash plume slowly began spreading and there were multiple eruptions. It spread across Europe and it affected the UK, France, Germany, later on Italy and many other countries. Okay. So, what was the effect? In the middle of this particular, this particular volcanic eruption, the period of its activity, main activity, was from something like 15th to 21st of April 2010. As on 19th April, okay, the whole world normally witnessed around 16,838 available seat kilometers. Out of that, within Europe on a normal day would be 38% or 6,458, but close to 5,000, 4899 to be precise, 29% of the world's available seat kilometers were directly affected on that one particular day, which was the peak day of this particular eruption. Here is a composite picture that shows the spread of the ash plume over that nearly 1 week of volcanic eruption. The volcano is shown by the red dot in this particular figure, and you can see that slowly the eruption has spread, and because of the winds, it can take various kinds of shapes. In short, a large part of the globe was affected by the presence of this ash. This picture shows an image of the partial as well as total closure of air traffic on one particular day, that is 18th April. The areas marked in red color indicate total closure and the areas marked in orange color show partial closure. So, you can see much of the part of Europe was totally affected, either totally or partially, because of this particular volcanic eruption. Here is the effect from 15th April to 21st April, just 1 week of ash plume. How much does it affect? So, the red line, the dotted red line here indicates percentage of flights cancelled, the scale is on the left hand side. So, you can see that on Sunday 18th April, close to around 80% of the flights they had to be cancelled, and the blue line indicates the estimated daily revenue loss in million US dollars per day. So, we see that on 18th April, because 80% flights were cancelled, there was a $450 million loss in revenue. Okay. So, if you just see, if you work out these numbers, you will appreciate that just 1 week of volcanic eruption has led to such a huge effect on the air transportation sector. Okay. Let us look at the passenger and revenue impact per day. Okay. So, it shows that the largest percentage was about 3% from one specific country, UK to United States. But if you just add up, you find it was approximately 12 lakhs 50,000, 12.5 lakh passengers had to be affected, which is basically 1,250,000. As far as the revenue is concerned, the total revenue loss per day was about 418 million US dollars. So, huge effect on the European industry. 70% was affected, but even North America had a 10% effect. Okay. So, if you look at the airline shares, although the volcanic eruption took place over Europe, but there was also an effect felt in Asia Pacific and North America. And obviously, Europe was the largest affected. So, the total percentage total of available ASKs close to 75% for Europe, 80% on one particular day, and it just fell down. So, this is how it reduced. Okay. Now, let us look at effect of natural disasters like tsunami and typhoons after the volcanic eruption. We will first look at the tsunami that took place in 2011 in Japan, and the effect of that on the Sendai International Airport is captured in this photograph. You can see that the whole airport is completely inundated with water and slush. So, obviously, no operations are possible on this one specific day. Okay. And the effect of that was huge on the markets associated. You can notice here that about 134.8 million passengers, mostly originating from Japan, were lost, and the revenue was about 62,478 million US dollars. Okay. This is the impact on air traffic, and this is the impact on the exposure to various markets. So, the Japanese domestic travel was 100% affected, and the next largest was China, followed by Taiwan, South Korea, and then the other countries had relatively lower effect. So, the aftermath of 2011 tsunami was to create measures for preparedness and risk mitigation of tsunamis. So, tsunami barriers and defenses were thought about, and there was a plan to construct protective barriers and walls at airport facilities and adjacent areas to prevent the effect of tsunamis. The infrastructure at airports had to be elevated. So, to raise the critical airport infrastructure above the potential tsunami inundation levels, this is for the runways, for the taxiways. This is not easy, this requires huge amount of investment. If you have to fill up the whole area and raise the whole airport to higher levels, it is not very easy. And then early warning systems were brought about and installed. These are the ones that can give us advance warning of the impeding tsunamis and other natural disasters, and the alerts have to be timely, and these alerts are for whom? They are for the airport authorities, they are for the personnel, and do not forget, large number of people live near the airport. The community around the airport is quite huge and they also have to be alerted. Okay. So, these are some of the efforts which have been now brought into place after the lesson that we learnt. Then in 2018, in the month of September, there were 2 typhoons, class 5 typhoons, which caused havoc. There was Typhoon JB based in Japan and Typhoon Mangkhut based in Philippines. So, Typhoon JB on 4th September 2018, it started from the Osaka airport. I mean, it was there at other places, but the main air transportation sector which got affected was the Osaka airport, and then from there it went to the Kyoto area. In case of Mangkhut, which came about 11 days later, the origin was Philippines and it travelled towards China. But interestingly, the main airport in Manila was not very heavily affected by this particular Typhoon Mangkhut. More effect was felt actually in China. So, because of Typhoon JB, the Kansai airport and the Itamai airport in Japan had to be shut down because it affected that a lot. As far as Typhoon Mangkhut is concerned, the Macau airport, the Hong Kong airport, the Guangzhou airport and the Shenzhen airport, they were most affected. Kansai airport was able to resume only after a complete shutdown for 4 days and then slowly, but full recovery took place only by 21st September. So, for 4 days there was absolutely no traffic. Slowly traffic was started, but it took such a long time to fully recover. In case of Typhoon Mangkhut, there were more than 1400 flights cancelled. Okay. And because of these 2 typhoons, 0.5% of the global passenger activity was affected, 0.3% because of Typhoon JB and 0.2% because of Typhoon Mangkhut. But it is quite a lot. Okay. And finally, we will look at the latest pandemic with which the world has just recently recovered, and it is fresh in our memory and it had led to a far reaching impact. So, this is the latest shock event which the global aviation industry has felt and is now recovering from. So, the global aviation industry was immediately affected. Travel restrictions and economic downturn led to huge reduction in the demand for airline services. You can see in this graph that right up to March 2020, the air travel in 2020 was slightly below. I mean, the downturn started by about January. Okay. The repercussions of COVID-19 actually started to show itself in December 2019, that is why it is called as COVID-19. But the major brunt was felt actually in April, May of 2020. So, you can notice here that compared to the 2019 levels which are shown here, the levels were higher in 2020, which is expected because air transportation grows every year, but somewhere in the February of 2020 it started dipping, and then there was a huge dip in the month of March, April, and after that, thanks to the transportation of vaccines, essential services like oxygen cylinders, oxygen equipment, etc., the cargo sector started to pick up, and because of that you see a attempt to recovery. But there is a huge gap, and that gap is taking time. The trend here is ending at September 2020, but if you look at the year on year data of ICAO for the year 2020, you notice, just look at 2 months. In the month of April, the passenger demand was down by 90% compared to the last year, but it recovered by August to around 75%. It is still much below, but there is some recovery. The freight transportation went down 30% in the month of April, but as I said, there was a recovery in the freight transport because of the need to transport essential goods. Many passenger aircraft were overnight either converted or simply used as aircraft for transporting equipment. There were many challenges and uncertainties that we faced because of COVID-19, especially in the air transportation sector. These are divided into two parts, the medium term and the long term. In the medium term, the operating cost increased because of the health and safety measures which impacted the airports and the airlines, similar to the 2009 swine flu, when sanitation, provision of masks, measurement of temperature, all these were implemented. The social distancing measures which were brought into place because of COVID-19, they reduced the passenger load factor by about 50%. That means half of what traffic was available was reduced. The shape of the recovery was uncertain, and it was influenced by many measures. Many countries introduced travel restrictions. For example, all flights to the US were completely curtailed. So, international flights from India to US were not there for a very long period of time, and also to the UK, and then they started again and they were stopped again. Then there was a reduced economic activity globally because many companies had to stop their operations, and the consumer behavior also changed. Commercial air traffic was slow to recover because there were more than 40% reduction in the number of flights. In the long term, okay, the COVID-19 has led to changes in the consumer behavior, okay, and that has led to the structural changes in the demand for air transportation. There is a permanent reduction in the travel demand because of modal shifts. Many people have learnt and realized that a large amount of business travel can be avoided by video conferencing. This is something that we had to do during the COVID-19 pandemic, and now we have become used to it. Plus, many countries developed high speed trains, and that replaced the air travel also, right. Plus, there were many policy interventions also. For example, in aviation, we often are affected by policy intervention, and this was very predominant during COVID-19. Okay. The governments all over the world intervened to protect employment in the large transportation firms, especially the air transportation firms, because air transportation manpower is a trained manpower, it is a licensed manpower, and you cannot simply hire and fire if you want to sustain the operations when the demand picks up. Okay. The goals of the various policy interventions included promoting technology, innovation, safety and coordination among suppliers. As you know, during COVID-19, many innovative schemes and technologies were brought in to allow us to have contactless travels, as well as to maintain social distancing, to sanitize the airport and other equipment. Then green industrial policies focused on low carbon aircraft, because many people realized during COVID-19 the advantage of having less pollution. We could feel the positive effects of low pollution. So, that has pulled the activities of green industrial policies. Okay. The government actually came in and supported the air transportation industry proactively during COVID-19 crisis in many ways. For example, the US government has spent $160 billion to support the airlines by August 2020. This is a huge one, and this graph shows the amount which is confirmed as well as which is proposed to be given to the various airlines. The basic graph shows the massive number that is supported by the US, and then there is the inner graph which is a magnified graph, because if you look at all the other countries, they are coming below 2.5. So, this whole area has been magnified. So, $2.5 billion was given by Chinese government, and if you go to the Indian government, it was about $0.15 billion support. So, the support was also in various forms: direct aid in terms of cash, subsidies in the terms of wages, or certain sectoral specific schemes. Then there were untargeted sectoral and firm specific measures. Then because of this particular COVID-19 pandemic, the debt levels of the airlines rose by around 30% in 2020, and it affects the investments and solvency proceedings of the airlines. So, there is a huge financial implication of COVID-19, and let us look at what are our learnings from this as far as our sector is concerned, the air transportation sector. The COVID-19 pandemic highlighted challenges such as liquidity, debt and uncertain prospects. It revealed the importance of air transport in peripheral areas or remote areas where we wanted to distribute the vaccine, or we wanted to distribute the equipment or the facilities that they were needing. It was impossible to do it only because of the existence of a robust and well established air transportation sector. Otherwise, overnight you cannot create the infrastructure. Okay. The retail tariffs of air carriers for domestic routes were regulated and subsidized also in some countries, okay, and these were because of the public service obligations. The government has some obligations to provide a minimum level of transportation service in remote areas. Because of that, there are many schemes introduced. So, because of this, the retail tariffs were regulated and subsidized. Because the industry was reeling under a lot of economic pressure, normally whatever it invests to reduce carbon intensity and to acquire more fuel efficient aircraft, those particular prospects are now at risk, because those are measures for the future, but airlines are trying to still recover from what they lost during the pandemic. Let us come to the final question of all this. What do we learn by the study of various shock events? Okay. Is the aviation industry shock proof? Can it withstand? After all, you have seen that the aviation industry has able to recover from all the shocks which we have discussed. Okay. As per IATA, in the 2018, the global air traffic has shown a remand of 6.5% as compared to 2017. Okay. So, the air traffic from 1985 has doubled in 1999 or 2000, and again doubled in 2014, and it continues to increase. Okay. So, this is the trend. The yellow line is the actual line and the dotted line is the trend. Okay. So, despite all these shock events that you see, the shock events are bringing the slope down temporarily, but as we recover from it, the line goes up. Sometimes it also goes above the trend till some other shock event, but then it also recovers. So, what is our conclusion from our study of the repercussions of the shock events on the civil aviation industry? Okay. So, shall we assume that just like the industry has always recovered from the past shock events, it will automatically recover, and we can assume or conclude that the industry is completely shock proof? No, that is not the case. Okay. There are many reasons for the resilient behavior of the airline industry, and that is why it is able to recover. Okay. First of all, the global air traffic bounces back because of the fall in the real cost of air travel with time. As time passes, because of technological developments, because of operational improvements, because of the rising disposable income of the people, the real cost of air travel actually falls with time. Okay. So, in the early 50s and 70s, when the shock events were not there or when they just started to come, that was the time when the industry was developing exponentially, okay, up to about 70s. Now, technology has resulted in an increase in the global air traffic by 10%, since the cost of the air travel has fallen by about 5% in real terms. Okay. So, the increase in standard of living of the middle class has also contributed. In other words, we cannot assume that it will always automatically recover. It will recover only if technology, operating efficiency continues to improve over time, so that the actual cost of travel keeps on reducing, then people will be able to recover. So, it is a hope for the future, just like we have recovered from the previous shock events. If we continue with the current developmental rate in technology and in operational efficiency, by and large the global aviation industry is quite resilient and it should be able to recover from shocks unless they are of a huge magnitude. Thank you so much for your attention.